I thought we were having a perfectly ordinary Sunday dinner. I thought the lasagna in the oven was the biggest thing on my mind that afternoon, and that the worst thing Brenda could possibly do was arrive 45 minutes late and criticize the way I set the table. I had no idea that she had spent the previous 6 months engineering a plan so calculated, so deeply buried in paperwork and quiet manipulation, that by the time I finally understood what was happening, the trap had already been sprung and I was standing in the middle of my own kitchen, holding a folder of documents that made the floor feel like it was dissolving beneath my feet. She said it with the calm of someone who had rehearsed the words 100 times in a bathroom mirror. She said it while cutting her lasagna into neat, precise little squares, not even looking up at me, as though what she was saying was not a declaration of war, but a simple logistical arrangement, the kind of thing families discussed over dinner all the time. "I paid off your mortgage," she said, setting down her fork with a small, deliberate click against the ceramic plate. "So I think it's only fair that Melissa comes to stay." And Jason, my husband of 4 years, the man who had held my hand through my grandmother's funeral and told me that this house was our future, said absolutely nothing. He cut his lasagna. He looked at his plate. He did not look at me. To understand how those words landed, you need to understand what that house meant to me and what I had believed, truly, completely believed, about my life in the months before that Sunday. The house on Birchwood Lane was my grandmother's. Margaret Eleanor Voss had lived in it for 41 years, raised 3 children in it, buried a husband from its front porch, and grown a rose garden along the south fence that still bloomed every June in shades of pale yellow and deep, bruised red. When she died, she left it to me. Only me. Not to my mother or my 2 aunts, but specifically to me, because I was the one who had driven her to chemotherapy every Thursday for a year and a half, and because she told me once, during one of those long drives when she was too tired to keep her head up and rested it against the window, that I was the only person in the family who never made her feel like a burden. I did not inherit wealth. I inherited a house with a mortgage, a leaking roof, and a rose garden that needed constant attention. But I also inherited the specific weight of something chosen, something loved and deliberately passed on, and that weight was not something I was ever going to let go of easily. I was 27 when she died. I was 2 years into my job as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm downtown, and I was making decent money. Not spectacular money, not the kind that makes people stop asking about your student loans, but enough. I restructured my budget completely after the inheritance. I gave up the apartment I shared with 2 roommates in the Riverside neighborhood and moved into Birchwood Lane. I repainted the walls myself, pale gray in the living room and a warm sage green in the kitchen, the color my grandmother had always said she wanted but never gotten around to. I fixed the roof with a contractor named Pete, who charged fairly and didn't talk too much. I paid extra on the mortgage every single month without fail, sometimes sacrificing the kind of small indulgences, new clothes, weekends away, decent wine, that my colleagues took for granted. And 4 years after my grandmother's death, 13 months before that Sunday dinner, I made the final payment. I sat in my car outside the bank for a full 10 minutes afterward, holding the confirmation paperwork with both hands, not crying exactly, but breathing in the slow, deliberate way that comes just before tears or just after something enormous has been resolved. This house was mine. Every beam and window frame and inch of that rose garden was mine, paid for with my labor and my sacrifice and the trust my grandmother had placed in me when she signed her will. I met Jason 8 months after the last mortgage payment, which felt at the time like good timing, like the universe had arranged things so that I would arrive at the beginning of this new chapter already standing on solid ground, already whole, already unafraid. We met at a friend's dinner party, the kind where someone always brings a bottle of wine that turns out to be surprisingly good, and the conversation runs long and everyone stays 2 hours later than they planned. Jason was charming in the quiet way that I've always found more compelling than the loud kind. He listened carefully. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later in ways that felt attentive rather than calculated. We dated for 18 months before he proposed, and when he asked me to marry him, he was standing in the kitchen of the Birchwood Lane house in the late afternoon light that comes through the south window and turns everything golden and warm, and he said that he had never felt more at home anywhere in his life. I should have paid more attention to the way he said that, not because I think his feeling was false, I believe he meant it in his way, but because Jason's definition of home and what came with it turned out to be more complicated, more entangled with the woman who had raised him than I had ever fully understood. Brenda Morrison was 61 years old, 5'4", and operated with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of getting what she wanted, while appearing to want nothing at all. She had steel gray hair that she wore in a neat low chignon, and she dressed in the kind of tasteful, understated clothes, linen slacks, cashmere cardigans in muted colors, that suggested both money and restraint, though I came to understand over time that the restraint was the more carefully cultivated illusion of the two. She had been widowed when Jason was 19, and she had raised him and his younger sister Melissa largely on her own after that, a fact she mentioned often enough that it had ceased to register as information and functioned instead as a kind of ambient pressure, a moral weight that colored every interaction, every request, every boundary crossed. She had done everything alone. She had sacrificed. She was owed. When I first met her, I found her merely slightly exhausting. She had an opinion about everything and delivered it with the same tone she might use to read from a manual, matter-of-fact, unquestionable, slightly impatient with any hesitation on the part of her audience. She thought the sage green in my kitchen was a bit much. She thought I worked too many hours. She thought Jason should have proposed sooner, and that 18 months of dating was an indulgence that spoke to a certain irresponsibility on his part, though she phrased this not as criticism of Jason, but as gentle concern for me, as though my time were a resource that had been unnecessarily wasted. I absorbed all of this with the patient neutrality I had developed over a childhood with a demanding mother of my own, smiled, offered more coffee, and told myself that she was harmless, that she was just a woman who needed to feel important in her son's life, that I could handle it. I was wrong about all three of those things, but I would not understand that for another year. The first thing I noticed, the first thing that lodged itself in my mind like a splinter too small to remove, but too irritating to ignore, was the way Brenda talked about the house. She started doing it about 3 months after Jason and I were married, when she came for a long weekend visit in late September and spent most of Saturday walking slowly from room to room with a coffee mug in one hand and a look of careful assessment on her face, the way a real estate agent might move through a property they were preparing to list. She paused in the doorway of the second bedroom, the one I used as a home office, and said, almost to herself, "This would make a lovely guest room." I said pleasantly that it was my office and I needed it to work from home on deadline weeks. She nodded in the way people nod when they've heard something but not accepted it, and moved on to the hallway where she stood for a moment looking at the linen closet and said, "You've got quite a bit of storage here." I agreed that I did. She said, "Melissa could make good use of that. She's still living in that dreadful studio." I said something non-committal. "Oh, I'm sure she'll find something soon," and went to refill my own coffee because I needed a moment in a room she wasn't in. I told Jason about it that evening after she'd gone to bed. We were in the kitchen, keeping our voices low the way we always did when she was visiting, a habit that I had already begun to resent without fully naming why. I said, "Your mom keeps talking about Melissa like she might move in here." Jason laughed, the easy laugh he deployed when he wanted to redirect a conversation without actually addressing it. "She just worries about Mel," he said. "She's been in that studio for 3 years, and it's not a great neighborhood. Mom just thinks she needs more space." I asked, carefully, whether he had ever given his mother any reason to think that Melissa moving in was a possibility. He said no. He said it with the kind of quick, uncomplicated certainty that at the time I took at face value. I finished my coffee. We went to bed. I told myself I was reading too much into an offhand remark from a woman who said many offhand things that turned out to mean nothing. But the offhand remarks kept coming, and they kept being about the same subject, and they kept being delivered in that same tone, casual, almost dreamy, as though she were simply narrating an imaginary future that she fully expected to become real. Over the following months, Brenda mentioned Melissa's living situation at least once during every visit and every phone call. She mentioned the second bedroom with pointed frequency. She mentioned twice that with 2 incomes in the house, Jason and I could certainly spare a room for family. She mentioned once that Melissa was practically raised in houses like this one, and that she would know how to take care of it, as though the house were already a shared resource, as though its care were a matter to be distributed among a family she had already imagined living inside it. Meanwhile, I noticed other things, small things, individually dismissible, but accumulating over time with the quiet insistence of water finding its way through the smallest crack. Jason started staying on the phone with his mother longer than usual, 30, 40 minutes at a time in the backyard or the car, rather than wandering through the house the way he used to when the calls were routine. He came home from a lunch with Brenda one Thursday in February, looking distracted and slightly too careful in the way he held his face, the way people look when they are trying not to let something show. I asked how it went. He said, "Fine. Good. The usual." He made dinner, pasta, simple and quick, and was attentive in the deliberately attentive way that I recognized from the early weeks of our relationship, the way of a person compensating. I noticed and said nothing because I did not yet have language for what I was noticing. It was just texture, just the uneasy grain of something I could feel but not name. The second thing I noticed was a question Brenda asked me in March, 3 weeks before the Sunday dinner, that changed everything. We were at her house for her birthday lunch, just the 4 of us, Brenda and Jason and Melissa and me. And at one point, while Jason and Melissa were in the kitchen doing dishes, Brenda leaned across the table toward me with the conspiratorial warmth she sometimes deployed when she wanted information. "Clara, darling," she said, "I've always wondered, when you paid off the mortgage on Birchwood, was that entirely from your own savings, or did you have some help?" I said, without hesitating, that it was entirely from my own savings, that I had been making extra payments for years and had paid it off about 14 months ago. She said, of course," and smiled in the way that didn't reach her eyes. "I just asked because Jason mentioned once that he'd helped with some expenses around that time, and I wasn't sure what arrangement you two had." I felt something cold and thin run along my spine. Jason had helped with no such thing. We had kept our finances largely separate in that first year of marriage, a decision we'd made together, carefully, and one that Jason had agreed to without objection. He had not contributed a single dollar to the mortgage payoff. He knew this. I knew this. And Brenda, I understood with sudden and unpleasant clarity, was testing something, measuring the gap between what she had been told and what was true. I mentioned the exchange to Jason that night. I described what she had asked and what I had said. I told him I was confused about where she had gotten the idea that he'd helped with mortgage payments. He was quiet for a beat too long. Then he said, "I think I might have mentioned once that I helped around the house when I was first staying over a lot. Groceries, that kind of thing. She probably got it mixed up." It was a plausible explanation. It had the shape of a plausible explanation. I filed it under misunderstanding and moved on with my week, and I hated later the ease with which I did that, the willingness to accept the first available innocent interpretation because the alternative was too ugly and too frightening to hold. It was a Thursday evening, 11 days before the Sunday dinner, when I found the folder. Jason was at his firm's quarterly team dinner, the kind that started at 7 and ran until 10 or 11, always, a ritual I had long since stopped attending because I found the partner's spouses exhausting and the free wine not good enough to compensate. I was working late at the kitchen table, spreadsheets open on my laptop, a mug of chamomile tea going cold beside me, the house quiet and comfortable in the way it only gets on evenings when you have it entirely to yourself. The rose garden was dark outside the south window. The refrigerator hummed. I was in the middle of a quarterly report when I got up to use the bathroom, and on my way back noticed that the door to the small closet we used for household files and documents tax returns, insurance papers, appliance warranties, was slightly ajar. I pushed it open the rest of the way and reached in to turn on the light. Everything looked normal at first. The neat rows of labeled folders, the accordion file I used for tax documents, the small fireproof box where I kept the deed to the house and my grandmother's will, but there was something I didn't recognize sitting on the shelf beside the accordion file. A manila folder, unmarked, sitting slightly apart from the others, as though it had been placed there recently and hadn't quite settled in among the longer-standing files. I picked it up with the absent curiosity of someone who simply wants to know what something is before putting it back in the right place. I opened it at the kitchen table, standing, not sitting, because I had only meant to glance. Inside were 4 documents printed on plain white paper, each one crisp and uncreased in a way that suggested recent printing. The first was what appeared to be a bank transfer confirmation, a single transfer of $42,000 dated 14 months ago, 3 weeks before I had made my final mortgage payment. The sending account was not one I recognized. The receiving account had our joint account number on it. The account Jason and I had opened together for household expenses. The memo field read, "Mortgage contribution, Birchwood Lane." I read that line 3 times. Then I set the document down on the table with very great care, as though it were something fragile that might break if handled incorrectly. And I stood very still with both hands flat on the table and breathed through my nose and tried to understand what I was looking at. The joint account number was correct. The date aligned with the period just before my final mortgage payment. But I had made that final payment entirely from my personal savings account. My individual account, the one Brenda didn't know about, the one Jason had no access to. The $42,000 in the joint account had never been touched for mortgage purposes. I had put it there over several months of careful saving and had drawn it down gradually on household repairs and renovations. The new water heater, the fence replacement, Pete's roof work. None of it had gone to the mortgage. None of it had come from whoever had sent this transfer. The second document was worse. It was a 1-page letter, typed and signed at the bottom with a signature I recognized as Brenda's, the same looping, confident script she used on birthday cards, addressed to no one in particular and dated 6 months ago. It read, in part, "As the primary financial contributor to the mortgage payoff on the property located at 14 Birchwood Lane, I maintain a legitimate interest in the ongoing use and occupancy of said property and reserve the right to arrange accommodation for members of my immediate family as circumstances require." Primary financial contributor. My hands were trembling now, a fine involuntary vibration that I felt in my fingertips and wrists and nowhere else, as though only my extremities had gotten the news so far and the rest of my body was still catching up. My throat tightened. The kitchen light seemed suddenly too bright, or maybe too dim. I couldn't tell which, only that something was wrong with the quality of the air in the room, with the way the space around me felt. I sat down heavily in the chair I had been working in 20 minutes ago, and I picked up the third document with fingers that were not entirely steady. The third document was a printed copy of what appeared to be an informal agreement. Not a legal contract, not notarized, but typed on plain paper with the confident formatting of something intended to look official. Between Brenda Ann Morrison and Jason David Morrison regarding the property at 14 Birchwood Lane. It specified that in exchange for Brenda's financial contribution to the mortgage payoff, Jason agreed to advocate for the accommodation of one additional family member in the property for a period no less than 12 months, with the option to extend by mutual agreement of all parties. The date on it was 8 months ago. 8 months ago. We had been married for 6 months at that point. I had not been consulted. I had not been mentioned. The property was listed as belonging to Jason Morrison and Clara Morrison, née Voss, which was factually correct. We had had my name added to nothing because the deed had always been in my name alone. But in this document, I appeared simply as a co-owner, one half of a unit, a party to an arrangement I had never been asked to join. I didn't read the fourth document right away. I sat for a long time. I don't know how long. The chamomile tea was entirely cold when I finally noticed it again. staring at the surface of the kitchen table, at the wood grain I had sanded and refinished myself 2 summers ago, at the small chip near the left corner that I'd always meant to fix and never gotten around to. The house was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on Birchwood Lane, its headlights sweeping briefly through the kitchen window. The refrigerator hummed. And underneath all of it, underneath the ordinary evening sounds of the house I had built and paid for and loved and earned, I felt the first cold, clean arrival of something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but was, I think now, the precise sensation of understanding, of finally, fully, seeing the shape of something that had been right in front of you, always, and that you had been choosing not to look at directly. The 4th document was a property appraisal. Current market value, $640,000. In the upper right-hand corner, in Brenda's handwriting, Melissa's share, 1/3. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time after I set the 4th document down. Melissa's share, 1/3, written in blue ink as casually as a grocery list, $213,000. I sat and I breathed, and I listened to the refrigerator hum, and what kept circling back, the thing my mind returned to no matter which direction it tried to go, was the date on the informal agreement between Brenda and Jason, 8 months ago. We had been married for 6 months at that point. He had stood in this very kitchen, in the light from the south window, and told me he had never felt more at home anywhere in his life. And 2 months later, he had signed his name to a document that promised his mother a piece of it. When I finally moved, it was not to cry or to call someone in a panic. My hands had stopped trembling, and something else had settled into their place. Something quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous. I photographed all 4 documents with my phone, twice, from different angles. I put the originals back in the manila folder, replaced it exactly where I had found it on the closet shelf, and closed the door. Then I went back to the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and stared at my spreadsheets until I heard Jason's key in the front door at 10:47. The whole time I sat there, perfectly still, I was doing something else entirely in the part of my mind I wasn't showing. I was planning. Jason came in with his jacket over one arm and the loose, easy look of a man who had eaten well and drunk moderately. He kissed the top of my head. He said, "Still at it?" I said yes. He got a glass of water, said goodnight, and went to bed. I did not tell him what I had found. Not that night. I needed 3 things before I was ready to say a single word. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, legally. I needed at least one person I could trust completely, and I needed to be certain, bone certain, the kind that doesn't waver when someone cries or apologizes, of what I intended to do. The next morning, while Jason was in the shower, I called my father. Robert Voss was 63 years old and had been a contracts attorney for 30 years before he retired. He had drafted the original inheritance documents when my grandmother left the house to me. He knew this property better than anyone alive, and he had liked Jason moderately at the beginning and with measurable decreasing warmth over the past 2 years, for reasons he had never articulated, but that I understood now in a whole new light. I told him, standing in the rose garden with the back door closed and my voice very low, exactly what I had found. There was a silence after I finished that I counted out in seconds. 4, 5, 6. Then he said, "Send me the photographs. Don't touch the originals. Don't say anything to Jason until we've talked." He called back 4 hours later. He had consulted with a colleague in property and family law. What he told me dismantled every last shred of doubt I might have nursed about whether I was overreacting. The transfer Brenda had made into our joint account had never been applied to the mortgage. I had paid it off entirely from my personal savings account. Her claim of being a primary financial contributor to the mortgage payoff was, at best, a profound misrepresentation and, at worst, a deliberate fabrication. The informal agreement between her and Jason had no legal standing. It was not notarized, was not a recognized legal instrument, and had been executed without my knowledge about a property I owned alone. It could not compel me to do anything, but it told me without any possibility of remaining innocent about it, that my husband had conspired with his mother behind my back to use my home as currency in a transaction I had never been asked to join. My father's voice was careful and quiet when he said, "The question now isn't whether you have legal protection. You do. The question is what you want to do about your marriage." I folded that question up and put it somewhere behind the anger, and I focused on what came next. The Sunday dinner was 3 days later. By then I knew, from my father and from my closest friend Diana, who had a law degree and the kind of unshockable clarity that made her invaluable in moments like this, that Brenda was planning to make her move that evening. Diana had found out through a mutual contact that Melissa had already given notice on her studio apartment. She was due to vacate at the end of the month. She had told a friend she was moving into a house. She had not said whose, so I set the table. I made the lasagna, the good one with bechamel and 3 kinds of cheese, and opened a bottle of wine I actually liked and lit the candles in my grandmother's brass holders. And I waited, with the electric patience of someone who knows exactly what is coming and has decided, absolutely, how they are going to meet it. Brenda and Melissa arrived together in Brenda's car. Melissa hugged me at the door and said the house looked beautiful. I thanked her and meant it to sound like the beginning of something, not the end. We ate. The lasagna was excellent. Brenda complimented it twice, 2 more times than usual. And I understood the compliments as advance payment, warmth deposited before a withdrawal. Jason was quiet in the way he had been for weeks, the way of a man waiting for something he has helped arrange and cannot stop, and has told himself he is only watching. He poured the wine. He did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes. Brenda waited until the plates were cleared and the truffle dish was on the table. She waited until we were all soft with food and candlelight. She picked up a truffle, examined it, and set it down. And she said it. "I paid off your mortgage, so I think it's only fair that Melissa comes to stay." The silence filled the room wall to wall. Melissa looked at the tablecloth. Jason looked at the tablecloth. Brenda looked at me, her face arranged in the soft, reasonable expression of a woman presenting terms she considers generous, a woman who has done the math and is simply communicating results. I let the silence run for 5 full seconds. Then I set down my coffee cup with a small, deliberate click. "You didn't pay off my mortgage, Brenda." She blinked. "Clara, you transferred $42,000 into a joint household account 14 months ago," I said. "That money paid for home repairs. It was never applied to the mortgage. The mortgage was paid entirely from my personal savings account, which you have no access to, and to which Jason has never contributed. I paid it off alone. The same way I have paid for everything in this house, alone, for 7 years, since my grandmother left it to me." Something flickered behind her composed face, a brief, involuntary fracture, quickly suppressed. "That money was given as a contribution," she said. The intention is documented," I said, "in a letter you wrote and placed in my files without my knowledge, in which you describe yourself as the primary financial contributor to a mortgage payoff you had nothing to do with. I've had that letter reviewed by a property attorney." The candles guttered once, briefly. Melissa's eyes were wide. Jason had gone the color of old chalk. He was looking at me now. Finally, he was looking at me. Brenda reset. The minute squaring of shoulders, the recalibration of her face, the shift from soft reason to something harder. She had come prepared for resistance. "Clara," she said, dropping her voice to something almost gentle, almost injured, "I have done everything for this family. Jason is my son. This house is mine," I said. "Has always been something he considered home. He met me 8 months after I paid off the mortgage. He does not own it. You do not own it." I looked at Melissa directly, and I made my voice as kind as I could without softening it. "And Melissa is not going to be moving in." Melissa let out a breath. Brenda's face did something I had never seen it do before. The composed surface cracked, and what came through was not grief but cold, bright fury, suppressed in an instant. "You have no idea," she said quietly, "how much I have done to keep this family." "To keep Jason what?" I said. The silence that followed was the most revealing thing she'd ever offered me. It was Jason who broke it. "Mom, maybe we should—" "Jason." I kept my eyes on Brenda. "Did you know your mother put those documents in our closet?" A long pause. 8 seconds. The clock on the sideboard ticked. "I didn't know about the closet," he said, "but you knew about the documents." A shorter pause. "I knew about the agreement." His voice was barely audible. I thought it was just something she needed to write down. I didn't think she was going to use it. I let that sit for a moment, let it breathe in the air between us, the full weight of months of daily silence. "You signed an agreement about my house without telling me," I said, "a property that has been in my family for over 40 years. You signed it 8 months ago, 2 months after our wedding, and you have known about it every single day since." "I was trying to keep the peace," he said. The words came out thin and miserable and true, and that was the worst part, that he believed them, that he had built a story in which his silence was an act of kindness rather than a betrayal. "You kept the peace," I said, "by giving her a piece of my house to negotiate with." Brenda stood up, controlled, deliberate, claiming the moral high ground by occupying higher physical ground first. "I want you to know that I have documentation of everything, that transfer, the agreement. I have an attorney who has advised me on my options for claiming a beneficial interest in this property, and I am prepared." "I'd like you to leave my house," I said. She stopped. "Both of you. Tonight." I glanced at Melissa, not unkindly because she hadn't designed this. "We can have whatever conversations need to be had through attorneys or through Jason, but I am not going to sit at my grandmother's table and be told what my home is worth to someone who has never cared about anything except what she could take from it." Brenda looked at Jason. The look was a command, a lifetime of conditioning compressed into a single glance. "Fix this. Choose me." And Jason looked at her, and then he looked at me, and something moved across his face. Shame, or grief, or the very late arrival of clarity. He said nothing. For once, for the first and perhaps only time that mattered, he said nothing at all. They left 20 minutes later. At the door, Brenda paused and looked back. "I hope you understand what you've done tonight," she said. "I do," I said. It was the truest thing either of us had said all evening. Jason stayed, not because I asked, I hadn't, but because he stood in the kitchen amid the ruins of the dinner and seemed unable to move. And eventually we sat across from each other and talked for almost 2 hours. He told me the whole story. How Brenda had come to him 4 months before the wedding. How she had framed the arrangement as something small, a safety net for Melissa, a gesture. How he had signed because he'd told himself it wasn't binding. How he'd told himself I'd never find out. How he'd told himself it would never come to this. I listened. When he finished, I told him that I believed he hadn't wanted to hurt me, and that it didn't change what he had done. When he asked what I wanted, I told him honestly that I wasn't sure yet. That was the first true answer either of us had given each other in months. What followed was slow and procedural and exhausting in the way of things that matter enough to do right. My father's attorney colleague sent a formal letter to Brenda's attorney outlining the legal reality. The deed was in my name alone. The transfer into the joint account constituted no legal claim on the property, and the informal agreement carried no enforceable weight. The letter noted, in mild but unmistakable language, that any attempt to claim a beneficial interest would be vigorously contested, and that Brenda's own self-authored letter would be central to any such proceeding. Her attorney responded once, briefly. Then there was silence. Melissa found a 2-bedroom apartment 3 weeks later and texted me to say she was sorry for the role she had played, even passively. I thanked her and meant it. She had been a pawn in someone else's plan, and I had never been able to hate her for that. Jason and I tried for 6 weeks, couples counseling, long, honest conversations. But honesty is not the same as repair, and what he had shown me, not in a single moment of weakness but in months of deliberate daily silence, was that when his mother's wants and my rights intersected, he had chosen her, not dramatically, quietly, over time. And I did not believe that 6 weeks of honesty could unwire something that had been built across years. He moved out in November to a small apartment across town, and we began the paperwork for a legal separation. There were no fights and very little anger by then. Anger had burned through in the first weeks and left something quieter behind. He took his belongings. He took nothing that had been my grandmother's. Spring came back to Birchwood Lane without asking anyone's permission, the way it always had. The rose garden pulled itself out of the cold soil in the particular, determined way of things that have survived worse, and the pale yellows came first along the south fence, and then the deep bruised reds, a week behind them. I stood on the back porch on a Saturday morning in late April, coffee in both hands, the good coffee, the kind I had quietly gone back to buying for myself, and I watched the roses and thought about Margaret Eleanor Voss, who had known something about choosing without ever calling it that, who had known that a house was not 4 walls and a deed, but a decision made and remade every morning in what you let in and what you held the door against. I had lost something real, a marriage and a version of the future I had genuinely believed in, and I was not going to pretend those were small losses. But I had also stood in my kitchen and said no to a woman who had spent years calculating exactly how long it would take before I was too tired to say it. And I had meant it with everything I had. Diana was coming over that afternoon. We were going to repot the front step containers and open a good bottle of wine and be precisely as loud as we wanted in every room of my house. I had a call with a new client at 10, a real estate fund that had come to my firm specifically for a report I'd written in the fall, during the weeks when I'd needed something to pour myself into completely. The morning was quiet and warm and entirely mine. I did not forgive Brenda. I want to be honest about that, because I think the stories that insist forgiveness is the goal are sometimes just another way of asking you to make someone comfortable with what they did to you. What I did was simpler and harder and more useful. I stopped giving her any room in my thinking at all. She had wanted something I had. She had tried to take it. She had failed. The truth was documented literally in her own handwriting, and it required no ongoing defense from me. What I kept, what I woke up to every morning in the house my grandmother had trusted to me, was the knowledge that I had not folded, that when someone looked at everything I had built and said, "I'll have a third of that," I had looked back and said the only word that was ever available to me, the one I should have been practicing for years in smaller rooms, before that kitchen, before those candles burning low in their brass holders on a Sunday that changed everything. No. The roses were extraordinary that spring. They always had been. I had just finally learned to look at them without worrying about who else might want them.